Dawn, October 20th, 1944, the eastern beaches of Leyte Island in the Philippines were shrouded in a suffocating humid rain and mist. The sea breeze carried no hint of a tropical paradise, but rather the chilling, metallic stench of steel and machine oil. As the defending Japanese soldiers poked their heads out of their muddy trenches, trying to peer through the morning fog toward the vast ocean, they witnessed a doomsday canvas that would make anyone's heart stop. A full 700 American warships painted in dark gray camouflage pressed down on the horizon like an iron thundercloud. This was no ordinary landing. This was a storm of vengeance, a merciless meat grinder about to crush everything in its path. In the brief 66 days that followed, this island, covered in lush coconut groves and primordial jungles, would be transformed into the most brutal purgatory of the Pacific War. Over 79,000 Japanese soldiers would be reduced to bleached bones here, while American fatalities stood at 3,500. 22-1. This was not merely a cold, cruel casualty ratio. It was a death warrant written in blood, declaring the irreversible collapse of the Japanese Empire. In these blood-stained waters and muddy mountains, humanity witnessed the birth of the first organized Kamikaze suicide attacks. It also saw the outbreak of the largest and most tragic naval battle in human history at Leyte Gulf, and the absolute severing of Japan's maritime lifeline to its southern resource zones. This was a fatal, absurd show, one decisive battle casually sketched onto a map with red and blue pencils by arrogant commanders in the air-conditioned, comfortable conference rooms of Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. These were men who had never set foot on a front line, and the price? 79,000 vivid lives left to gnaw on tree bark and die in despair amidst torrential rain and draughting mud. General Douglas MacArthur's iconic Wade ashore was the fulfillment of his world-shocking promise made 2 years prior: "I shall return." But behind this vow of extreme personal heroism lay a deadly strategic gamble between the United States and Japan, and a fatal internal rift within the Japanese high command. Let's rewind the clock just a few months. General Tomohiki Yamashita, the supreme Japanese commander tasked with defending the Philippines, stood in his Manila headquarters. The legendary Tiger of Malaya, who had once swept invincibly across the Malay Peninsula, stared at a ragged deployment map with a deeply furrowed brow. As a battle-hardened veteran, he acutely perceived the true intentions of the massive American fleet. Yamashita knew perfectly well that Leyte's rugged terrain, narrow roads, and lack of strategic depth made it entirely unsuitable for large-scale defensive warfare. If the Americans possessed absolute air and naval superiority, Leyte Island would become a colossal death trap. His recommendation was cold and rational: abandon the idea of a decisive battle on Leyte, withdraw all available forces to the vast hinterlands and complex mountainous terrain of the main island of Luzon. He wanted to establish a formidable defensive network to drag the Americans into a war of attrition. Only then could Japan meaningfully delay the American advance toward the Japanese home islands. However, thousands of miles away in Tokyo, the high-ranking generals of the Imperial General Headquarters were thoroughly possessed by a pathological gambler's mentality. They could not accept the reality of the retreating Japanese empire, nor could they tolerate showing even the slightest strategic concession to the Americans. In their eyes, Leyte was not just a geographic coordinate, it was the final fig leaf of imperial dignity, the imperial lifeline safeguarding the southern oil routes. If the Philippines fell, the petroleum from Borneo, the rubber from Malaya, and the metals from the Dutch East Indies could no longer reach the Japanese homeland. Massive war machine would grind to a halt. Consequently, a chilling, unquestionable order was issued from Tokyo, completely vetoing Yamashita's lose-on-defense plan and forcibly activating the Operation Codename Showan. The High Command's directive was simple and sheer madness: hurl every ship that could still sail, every warplane that could still fly, and every soldier who could still hold a rifle into the massive meat grinder of Leyte. They intended to annihilate the main body of the American Pacific Fleet on the beaches of Leyte, attempting to use a miraculous victory to reverse the tide of the entire Pacific War. Those elites far away in Tokyo who barely even knew what Leyte's terrain looked like effortlessly condemned 80,000 soldiers to a path of absolute annihilation simply to prove their absurd pride of never retreating. And tens of thousands of American troops stormed the beaches of Leyte under MacArthur's watchful eye on October 20th. The countdown to destruction officially began. The U.S. Sixth Army, like an unstoppable torrent of steel, carried overwhelming firepower and endless supplies ruthlessly tearing through the fragile Japanese coastal defenses. In a desperate bid to salvage the situation on the island, the Japanese Navy wagered the Empire's final chips. A decoy fleet of 4 aircraft carriers, a central force featuring the largest battleships in human history, the Yamato and the Musashi and the Southern, was attempting a flanking maneuver, all lunged desperately toward Leyte Gulf. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, an apocalyptic naval judgment spanning thousands of miles of ocean and involving hundreds of warships. On those magnificent yet death-soaked waters, the cruelty of war was magnified infinitely. Stripped of air cover, the Japanese surface fleet was little more than a giant floating target for American carrier-based aircraft. The colossal battleship Musashi, once the pride of the Japanese Navy and an unsinkable symbol of power, faced a terrifying sky-blackening bombardment by American warplanes in the sea by sea. Torpedoes tore gaping bloody wounds into its heavy armor, while armor-piercing bombs blasted its intricate decks into a scorched inferno. Even with its terrifying displacement and seemingly indestructible hull, the moment it lost air supremacy, it became nothing but a giant, clumsy iron coffin. After hours of desperate struggle, the steel behemoth finally sank into the freezing depths, staking the despairing screams of over 1,000 Japanese sailors with it. Meanwhile, the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, treated as sacrificial pawns to lure the American main fleet away, were predictably shredded into burning scrap metal by American bombers. In this massive naval showdown spanning several days, the Japanese Navy was virtually wiped out of existence. 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 10 cruisers, and countless destroyers were left at the bottom of the sea forever. By the end of October, the spine of the Japanese Empire's maritime power was completely shattered, reduced to a ghost fleet, merely gasping for its final breaths. It was during this suffocating naval battle that a terrifying scene was born, one that still sends shivers down the spines of American veterans today. When conventional tactics completely failed to halt the American advance, when carriers had no planes and when sailors had no hope, Japanese commanders formed the first organized suicide attack force in human history, the Kamikaze. Japanese youths barely in their 20s who had not yet even tasted the beauties of life were strapped into obsolete planes packed with high explosives. Driven by a fanatical pathological faith, they piloted their aircraft like deadly meteors with no return tickets, diving straight into the decks of American aircraft carriers. When the first Kamikaze plane crashed in a blinding fireball, melting a steel deck into a sea of fire, the Pacific War entered a phase of utterly irrational madness. This suicide tactic, entirely defying the human instinct for survival, caused massive psychological shock and heavy equipment losses for the Americans. But it could not change the ultimate outcome of the Leyte campaign. It was nothing more than the hysterical, despairing howl of a dying empire paid for in the blood of its youth. The disastrous defeat at sea definitively signed the death warrant for the Japanese army on Leyte. Yet the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo remained intoxicated by their own fabricated delusions of victory. Instead of ordering a withdrawal, they frantically continued to funnel reinforcements to the island. This was the meat-grinding Operation TA. Transport ship after transport ship packed with elite Kwantung Army troops drawn from Manchuria were forced into Ormoc Bay, which was firmly controlled by the Americans without any air cover or escort fleets. This was not a strategic reinforcement, it was naked mass murder. American warplanes and submarines acted like wolves hunting sheep, mercilessly slaughtering these defenseless wooden and steel transports on the open water. Countless Japanese soldiers were blown to pieces in the cargo holds or drowned in the freezing Visayan Sea before they even set foot on Leyte or fired a single shot. The ocean was dyed a shocking dark red by the blood of tens of thousands, the surface littered with burning debris. Desperate cries for help faded into the smoke-filled sea breeze. Eventually falling dead silent, the entire bay became an insatiable, bloodthirsty monster. For those lucky enough to survive the air raids and make it ashore, or for the soldiers of the Japanese 35th Army, already stationed there, the real hell was only just opening its doors. As the Americans pushed steadily inland from the beaches, the fighting quickly shifted to the rugged central mountains of Leyte. November and December marked the most violent monsoon season in the Philippines. Torrential rain poured, as if the sky had been torn open, transforming the entire battlefield into a bottomless, viscous swamp of mud. There was no romantic heroism here, only nauseating rot, rampant disease, and a soul-devouring hunger. The Americans possessed an endless logistical supply chain. They could eat hot military rations during breaks in the rain, drink sterilized water, and use seemingly limitless, heavy artillery to shave down the mountains where the Japanese hid, turning the entire jungle into scorched earth. On the other side of the front line, the plight of the Japanese troops had broken through the absolute limits of human endurance. With air and sea supremacy completely lost their supply lines, worse, over 70,000 were hopelessly trapped in this green purgatory. They had no food, no ammunition, ray supplies, not even a mouthful of clean water. Initially, they managed to survive by looting the rations of local Filipino villagers. But as the front lines shrank, even the wild-grass tree roots and banana bark were completely consumed. On treacherous highlands dubbed Breakneck Ridge and Shoestring Ridge, the Americans and Japanese engaged in a gruesome back-and-forth slaughter. Every inch of mud was repeatedly soaked in the blood of both sides. Every casualty rapidly decomposed in the muddy water, emitting a suffocating, putrid stench. In this extreme environment, starvation quickly became a much colder, more ruthless killer than American bullets. The soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, who had once proudly considered themselves invincible on the training grounds of Manchuria, were now reduced to a horde of emaciated, hollow-eyed ghosts. They collapsed powerlessly in the muddy underbrush, completely drained of even the strength to lift their rifles. Due to the horrific sanitary conditions, malaria and dysentery spread like wildfire through the damp camps, tormenting them until they lost control of their bodies, wishing for death. In this God-forsaken, and the bottom line of human morality was entirely shattered. Some starving soldiers, desperate to live just one more day, used trembling hands in the dark, rainy night to slice the meat off their fallen comrades and swallow it whole. Some, their minds completely broken by the dual torment of disease and despair, pulled the pins on their final grenades. But most simply curled up quietly in the bushes or muddy foxholes, recalling the cherry blossoms of their hometowns, as they silently stopped breathing in extreme cold and hunger. Meanwhile, the high-ranking generals in Tokyo sat in their warm, comfortable offices, sipping hot tea, listening to staff officers sugarcoat the battle reports, and preaching about the Bushido spirit and honorable death. They ordered the frontline soldiers to fight to the last man. They didn't know, or simply didn't care, that in the suffocating mud of Leyte, in the face of all-consuming hunger and despair, Bushido and imperial glory were nothing but utter ridiculous nonsense. While Tokyo's arrogance and ignorance were still blindly squandering soldiers' lives on a map the American military used a highly precise tactical scalpel to sever the final throat of the Japanese forces on Leyte. The date was December 7, 1944. It was a day of profound historical irony. Exactly 3 years prior, the Japanese Imperial Navy had shocked the world with a sneak attack that left Pearl Harbor in flames, dragging the United States into the quagmire of the Pacific War. 3 years later to the day, the Americans returned the humiliation with interest. The U.S. 77th Infantry Division, under the cover of immense naval and air firepower, launched a shockingly bold amphibious landing on the west coast at Ormoc Bay, a brilliant tactical strike that directly bypassed the heavy defenses the Japanese had painstakingly built in the central mountains, plunging a cold dagger straight into their exposed rear. Ormoc Port the only lifeline through which the Japanese had funneled troops and supplies to Leyte. The bloody bay that had swallowed countless transport ships changed hands in just 2 days, when the stars and stripes fluttered over the ruins of Ormoc. The 70,000 Japanese soldiers still holding out in the muddy mountainous jungles of Leyte were completely reduced to a dying, isolated army, whose life support had just been unplugged. Their retreat was severed. Before them stood the Americans with absolute fire superiority. Above them were warplanes bombing them endlessly. Death had sent its final invitation. On December 26, General MacArthur triumphantly announced to the world that the Leyte campaign had achieved a decisive victory, that the island was fully secured under American control, yet for the Japanese soldiers trapped in the primordial jungles of the Central Highlands. MacArthur's declaration of the end was actually the beginning of their most extreme despair. The large-scale conventional military confrontation may have concluded, but a long, bloody and entirely undignified jungle extermination war had just raised its curtain, faced with the total loss of control over Leyte. General Yamashita, the man who had originally argued to abandon Leyte and defend Luzon, made a cruel but militarily logical decision in his Manila headquarters. He officially cut off all contact with the 35th Army on Leyte, throwing away these once elite troops of the great Japanese Empire like a foul-smelling rag. The final directive from the Highcom, and was terrifyingly cold: the defenders of Leyte would receive not a single grain of rice, not a single reinforcing soldier, and absolutely no evacuation plan. They were ordered to become self-sufficient and place and to wage guerrilla warfare in the jungle until they bled their very last drop. This was not a combat order. It was a death warrant signed by the highest echelons of the empire, demanding the mass sacrifice of over 70,000 men. Entering 1945, the deep mountains and old-growth forests of Leyte morphed into a graveyard, reeking of decomposition. Bereft of unified command, the remnants of the Japanese army quickly disintegrated into countless small bands of stragglers wandering like wild ghosts. They were half-naked, their bodies covered in oozing ulcers, their eyes bulging from extreme starvation and malarial fevers, emitting a bone-chilling feral glare. They were no longer soldiers, they were beasts slingering merely to steal one more breath. Vengeance burned brightly on the very land they had once brutally occupied. Filipino guerrilla fighters, harboring a deep-seated hatred from 3 years of brutal occupation, and knowing the terrain, intimately teamed up with American patrols to execute a ruthless hunt through the jungle. Every gunshot echoed the fall of another starving Japanese soldier into the mud. They didn't even have the strength to raise their weapons to return fire. For many, hearing the approaching footsteps of American troops didn't evoke fear, but rather a sickening sense of relief. Due to the tight American blockade, these Japanese stragglers could not get anywhere near water sources or villages that might have food. In the face of extreme starvation, the boundaries of human civilization, built over thousands of years, collapsed completely. Tree bark, grass roots, venomous snakes, insects, anything that could be shoved into a mouth was swallowed. When even these ran out, the darkest scenes played out in the tropical rainforest. Living soldiers stared like vultures at their dying comrades. The moment a breath stopped, they would draw their bayonets and, like starving wolves, carve the flesh off their peers. This was the sacred, inviolable Bushido spirit outed by the Tokyo Highcom and in the very real mud of Leyte. It was reduced to the most primitive, grotesque, cannibalistic hell. This brutal hunt, known as the mopping up. Operations lasted until the spring of 1945, and even after Japan's unconditional surrender in August. A handful of completely isolated Japanese soldiers, living like wild men, remained hidden in the deep mountains. Across the 66 days of the main campaign and the long jungle slaughter that followed, 79,000 Japanese soldiers buried their bones and blood forever in the mud of Leyte. 79,000 vivid lives. 79,000 young men who once had parents, wives, and children waiting for them back home, ultimately turned into ignored, forgotten skeletons in a foreign land. the American death toll stood at just 3,500. It was a completely one-sided massacre, but the ones pulling the trigger weren't just the Americans. With their Garand rifles and Browning machine guns, it was the politicians and zealots in suits and generals. Stars sitting in the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to cover up their massive strategic blunders and to protect their illusory face. They knew Leyte was an inescapable death trap, yet they used lies and strict orders to feed batch after batch of young men into this bottomless meat grinder. The 79,000 soldiers who died in the mud in the bay did not die a glorious death for their country. They died as victims of the arrogant, ignorant murder committed by their own high command. After the war, General Yamashita faced the trial of the century. In Manila, he was accused of holding unavoidable command responsibility for the series of horrific atrocities committed by his troops in the Philippines. Ultimately, the once invincible Tiger of Malaya was sent to the gallows, becoming the first high-ranking general in human history to be executed under the doctrine of command responsibility. Yet as the noose tightened around his neck, many of the true masterminds, the men who sat in comfortable Tokyo offices, casually drawing lines of death across Leyte with red and blue pencils, sending 79,000 men to hell, escaped justice and lived out their twilight years peacefully in post-war Japan. Today, the wind and drain of time have washed away the bloodstains on the beaches of Leyte. Lush coconut groves have grown over the mountains. Once leveled by artillery fire, on the surface the island has returned to the tranquility and beauty of a tropical paradise. But if you stand on the coastline of Ormoc Bay on a windy night, listening to the waves crash against the rocks, you can almost hear the wind carrying the hysterical cries of 79,000 despairing souls. If you want more historical analysis of World War II's most controversial strategic decisions and the brutal reality of Pacific battles, crush that like button and subscribe. I'm your strategy observer. I'll see you on the next battlefield.